Our guest in the Fast Lane today is probably one of our best-known politicians and perhaps one of the most polarising. She's enjoyed remarkable success, first in business and second in Parliament. She has massive support amongst younger voters and even turned Auckland Central from a blue stronghold to a green one. She's now co-leader of the Green Party, and it's probably pretty obvious by now that I'm talking about Chlöe Swarbrick. Welcome, Chlöe.
Kia ora, what an intro.
First of all, I just actually realised that I have assumed your pronoun. I apologise.
Oh, no, yeah, of
Is
course.
she
Yeah,
okay?
she is,
All right.
yes.
I should know better, actually, because I know plenty of people who...
In this new woke world.
Exactly, and
where we respect people, crazy stuff.
I'm still catching up
Yes,
with
I
it,
am.
so
I am a woman, she, her, yes.
Excellent, very good. Thank you for coming along and sharing some thoughts on the industry, the automotive industry a little bit, but more widely than that with our listeners as well. First of all, how do you feel about the word polarising? Is that fair, and is it a good or bad thing?
Yeah, interesting. I do think that I can be perceived as controversial and therefore potentially polarising because I hold views on things. I'd like to say that means having integrity and being honest and transparent, because God forbid politicians tell you where they stand and are consistent and principled in that. But I mean, we were just saying before we came on here, I find it really fascinating actually talking to people who think that they'll hate me, because to them, for whatever given reason, I seem like the devil incarnate because of the things that they've seen mediated through social media or headlines or whatever the case may be. I love talking to them because firstly, they're some of the most honest conversations that you'll ever have. It's pretty straight up. And as soon as we get past that immediate kind of knee-jerk, then all of a sudden you're able to kind of come back down to earth and go, okay, well, what do you believe in? And genuinely approach someone with a sense of curiosity. And, I hold the very earnest, and some may say naive view, that New Zealanders tend to actually have a heck of a lot of stuff in common. We care about each other and the planet that we live on. And if we come back from the pointy end of where politics, and particularly this kind of hyper-metabolistic politics that we're in at the moment, tends to put us in, and just go back to the baseline of where those views might potentially come from and start to unpack some of those experiences, again, we find out that we've got a lot more in common than we otherwise might realise. And I think this is where I'm really wary of how the politics of division is currently kind of playing out. Right. If we were able to create space, particularly in our local communities, so by that I mean in our neighbourhoods, in our libraries, in our pubs and otherwise, to just make it normal to talk about politics and the kind of aspirations that we have as a community and as a country, we'd be in a far better place.
Yeah, and I really would like to get your thoughts on that whole difficulty of being in public office these days, especially for women. But as a general rule of thumb, is it better to be sort of loved or hated as a politician? I mean, do you want to get a strong reaction, whether it's love or hate, rather than just being down the middle all the time, especially maybe if you're not one of the two major parties?
Yeah, interesting question. So I guess to your point, firstly, on the two major parties, I very strongly hold the view that no politician, no political party is entitled to absolutely anything. And that was obviously the approach that we took to Auckland Central in 2020 and then again in 2023. And going into 2026, I'd make exactly that same point again. I do not expect to be entitled to this. I want to prove to people that we've done the work on the ground and that we will continue doing that work. I believe that merit should show itself in that way. But there is also the case that when you're not the archetype or who is assumed to occupy positions of power, when you don't look and talk and sound like those people, then I think that you have to work a little bit harder in order to be considered valid or legitimate, where otherwise others kind of get a hall pass. And I think that's the privilege, for lack of a better term, of the kind of two legacy parties. But I just really encourage New Zealanders to reflect on how those legacy parties, particularly over the last 40 years, haven't necessarily delivered on things. And we do live within a democracy with MMP, which means that there are more options on the table than the kind of duopoly defaults that we are presented with. Then to, I guess, the start of your question around better to be loved or to be hated, I didn't necessarily come into this role with the intention of either. The joke that I make to my mates is that I raged so hard against the machine that I somehow ended up inside of it. And I feel really lucky or privileged, whatever way to characterise it, that I have always been myself. in this role, for better or worse. It may end up presenting me as polarising. But I think that has meant that my theory of change, you'd call it politically, or my approach to how I do my job, which is just to always be transparent about the fact that, of course, I don't know everything. Firstly, that was prompted by the fact that so many people were telling me I was so young that I couldn't possibly know what the hell I was doing.
Yep. Do you still
and
get
I just,
that,
less so. Someone the other day called me a young vet, by which I think they meant a young veteran. I obviously was first elected when I was 23 years old. I'm now 31. So as a former Prime Minister said, youth adjacent. But yeah, I think that being really straight up about what your values are, being really crystal clear about the fact that no one knows everything, and the best that we can possibly hope to do is to not be dogmatic and to be open and curious about other positions and points of view, then to try and reconcile that with the evidence about what actually works. Have a sense of appetite as well for risk, and knowing that when we are going to try and solve complex and big problems, that's part of the problem I think that we've had over the last 4 decades or so, is our bureaucracy has been built out by all of these layers of the onion, where there's so many levels of sign out that nothing ever seems to happen. So nothing ever seems to go wrong, but also nothing ever seems to go right. So, yeah, I've kind of just tried to approach things by being transparent, being honest, trying to stack up the evidence, and approaching and meeting people where they're at.
You just mentioned then you've gone sort of from raging against the machine to being part of the machine. Do you enjoy Parliament?
Really good question. I had a pretty funny experience with a mate of mine's dad a few years ago when I was just, talking to him about politics, and it had been a particularly rough time in Parliament over the preceding months. And I was complaining to him about Parliament and how toxic and awful it is. And as we were doing so, he told me about how he'd seen this mini doco that was produced a few years ago in which I'd said politics is effed. And he said...
You can swear. We're okay.
Yeah, okay.
You can swear.
It's akin to 95 BFM. But he was saying to me that felt like, firstly, either something that was a really cynical political play, because that would appeal to, people who believe that sentiment, or secondly, that was a really sad thing for a young person who was spending their entire life doing that to say about their job, for all intents and purposes. And we just kind of kept reflecting on it. And through that conversation, I came to reconcile that while a lot of the things about my job are gnarly and awful, I also get to spend every single day fighting for the things that I believe in, which is an immense privilege. So the kind of takeaway from that yarn was, shut the hell up and just do it and kind of get over yourself. So shout out to Jono.
There's been a lot of attention this year. We've just gone through local government elections, but at the general election too, a lot of talk about the abuse that candidates and politicians get, and especially women of colour particularly. You must have received some of that, and is there a typical segment that get it? Do you get it from the sort of pale male stale brigade? And what's the answer, more importantly? Yeah,
good question. Yes, I do get it. Obviously. I mean, you can see that manifest on the comment section on any of my social media pages, and it definitely fills my emails. I'm really grateful to have some amazing staff, the team who work with me, who filter through that, so I don't have to see a lot of it. As to what the solution is, look, again, I kind of come back to, I don't think that we are going to solve how polarised and how tense and how toxic our politics is getting by only looking at the surface level. And this is where I'm really wary of any proposition to potentially criminalise behaviour at that end, because we then just end up with more and more extremes and kind of, escalating further and further. So while it by no means is an overnight solution, I think that we have to figure out how we actually come back down to earth for a healthy, functional democracy, which means everybody having the ability to meaningfully participate and converse about the things that they believe in, which is deeply connected to people's material economic standing. If people do not have the adequate income or the adequate time to be able to participate in their lives, let alone to participate in community, then you can understand how things get so bloody tense.
And it's also part of a bigger problem, isn't it? Why do you think people, is this even fair to say, but why do you think people are less tolerant these days?
I think people have less time. I think, if you look at a few key economic indicators that have occurred subsequent to kind of, 1984 reforms, 1980 reforms worldwide, where there was kind of the shredding of the social safety net, where we were sold this lie of trickle-down economics, and we've seen the manifest consequences of that in the forms of greater homelessness, greater poverty, greater inequality, greater insecurity and precariousness in terms of people's day-to-day lives. I think that fatigue and exhaustion inherently wears people down and makes them more inclined to be defensive or offensive as opposed to constructive and productive in terms of how we approach each other. So I think there is that. That bleeds into a potential propensity towards, which I definitely think certain politicians and commentators take advantage of, people wanting what feel like simple solutions. And I think we've seen as supposedly centre-left parties have refused to deal with economic inequality getting worse. They instead have focused on this kind of cultural layer whereby they have placed certain people from structurally marginalised groups into supposed positions of power without changing anything about those structures of power, which is then, again, to a certain extent, understandably, put a target on the backs of those structurally marginalised people, which then provides a perfect opportunity for a strongman right-wing leader to come in and say, it's the gays or the migrants or whatever the case may be.
And we've seen that around the world.
Yeah, we have, and we also obviously see it here at home. So I think that all of those factors, again, if we just cut away all of the bullshit and the bluster, it really is about everybody having access to their basic material needs being met, like the foundational layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so that we're then able to actually properly participate in society and in democracy. And this is why I think it's really, really bloody hard for us to talk about any of the other issues that we face as a country or as a world in the form of climate change or in the form of democratic decline without also talking about people's economic and material circumstances.
So I don't sort of really want to go too far down this path because we've only got a limited amount of time, but how does that get fixed? Because yes, a lot of people are going through a tough time financially, economically. We all know about that, cost of living. But is the damage done to a certain extent, even if the good times return? I've sort of used that in very general terms, but have we entered an era of divisive politics, personality politics, attack politics, and just general intolerance in society that can be reversed?
In some ways, I think that we are definitely, evidently in that era, but I don't think that means that it's inevitable. I don't think that anything is inevitable. I mean, I wouldn't be doing my job if I did. I think other theorists have said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think that needs to be paired with the understanding that we currently live inside of a system of economic rules which were not handed down to us on stone tablets by some god or deity that we have to sacrifice to when it's angry. Those are a system of rules that were created by human beings, and those rules therefore can change when they do not work for the majority of people. So I think that it can't be beyond repair. Otherwise, what the hell is the point of anything that we're doing?
Yeah, there's not much point getting out of bed in the morning if that's the case for any of us.
Yeah.
A bit of a shift in sort of gear and tone here, but being an MTA podcast, we've been asking the other guests as they come on about what kind of car they drive and driving experiences and that sort of thing. Can I ask, and I'm not trying to be a smart-ass with this question, but it might sound like I am. I'm genuinely not trying to be a smart-ass, but do you drive a car? Do you own a car? Have you got a licence? All of those sort of things?
So I live in central Auckland and I do not own a car. I do have my full driver's licence and have had for a number of years, and I use a bunch of car short-term rentals, so Mevo and City Hop respectively, in cities across this country. Yeah.
Okay.
So I get to drive a lot of different types of cars, actually.
Right. Okay. Slightly random question, but have you ever seen a film called Singles?
No.
It's set in Seattle. It's about the grunge era.
Cool.
It's a really cool, funny comedy. And in it, there's a scene where one of the characters goes to the mayor of Seattle and he's got a proposal for light rail and walkways and greening up the city, and he's really earnest about it because he really believes in it. And the mayor just turns to him and simply says, people like their cars. and he shuts down the whole conversation. And I'm just curious, and around your thoughts about it. I mean, are cars a necessary evil to you, or do you see their value, or how do we? What's your thinking on how we move people away from that love of cars?
I mean, I think it makes sense that people love their cars because that is the immediate way that most people tend to get around. We have the highest rates of car ownership per capita in the world, to my understanding, and that might be directly correlated to or causing the fact that emissions, our transport emissions profile is the highest and the growing emissions profile in all of our cities. So, as to whether they're inherently evil, I don't believe that is the case. They're just a mode of transport, which kind of brings us to...
In an ideal world, would you have a world free of cars?
I think one of the best summarisations that I've ever heard of this issue is that in a functional society, we don't have a situation where everybody, including the poor, has their own private motor vehicle. It's where everybody, including the wealthy, use public transport because it is efficient, it is affordable, it is clean. So I would like to live in a city and in a country that has rapid, affordable, clean public transport where people can get around easily. I was actually talking to, a few years ago, my former youth MP, who talked about the sense of freedom that him and his peers felt when they got access to a driver's license, and how awesome it would be, and this was his proposition, if that same sense of freedom was available to young people through public transport. Again, I think that many parents would be complaining about how they become the chaperone to drive their kids all across the city to all of these different engagements. Yeah. And this is where I think, if we are just to move beyond the immediate knee-jerk response when we are hearing about public policy settings which might potentially make it easier to get public transport, and that might mean deprioritising potential use of private vehicles to get into certain places. If we could just see the bigger picture and understand that this isn't about, it is effectively about properly creating choice, because right now we have a system which is inducing congestion, which is hugely detrimental not only to people not having time because of how much time we spend squandering sitting in these traffic jams while we are the traffic jams, but also in terms of mental health and well-being.
How do you personally reconcile the reality of having to travel to things which are which do have an emissions factor? I guess the classic case is flying to a convention about climate change. It's that contradiction, isn't it?
Hugely.
So how do you deal with that on a personal level? How do you reconcile it in your mind?
You have to live in the world in order to change it.
Right.
It's one of the big internal turmoils that you deal with, particularly as a Green MP, But I think any person who has spent time contemplating all of their purchase decisions and trying to chase supply chains to, for any of the goods or services that we engage with, you very kind of quickly come to understand that there's a lot of nefarious things that are happening in those supply chains. But that kind of has to lead you to the place of not blaming individual people for making certain choices when there isn't really that much of a choice. We have to focus on changing the defaults through the system. And this is where, I'm not going to penalise or take a punitive approach to somebody who is, having to drive their private vehicle because that's the only option available to them because they live in South Auckland.
But you almost sort of apologise to yourself if you get on a plane or something like that?
I think I've had to reconcile the reality that unfortunately, I live in Auckland and I have to commute to Wellington for work. I would love an overnight rail service, and the Greens have been campaigning for that. But until we're willing to have a grown-up, mature conversation about investing in the infrastructure that New Zealanders deserve, unfortunately. I need to be in Wellington.
Yeah, no, fair enough. One thing I'm very keen to get your thoughts on is kind of the life cycle of the Green Party. And when I was in journalism, which was, admittedly a few years ago now, I covered a little bit of politics, and the Green Party was quite a different beast. It was led by Jeanette Fitzsimons, Rod Donald, Keith Locke, and now the party looks completely different from that. So just two questions from that, really. First of all, those leaders wore their heart very clearly on their sleeve when it came to the environment. Do you think that's got lost slightly in the process of change?
I think that, so first things first, the same 4 core charter principles for the Green Party have been consistent for 30 years. So those are ecological wisdom, recognition of the fact that resources are finite, even those resources that do regenerate need time and space and, God forbid, some planning, Shane Jones, fish stocks, when it comes to regenerating those resources. The second premise makes a lot of sense in the context of that first one, which is social responsibility. So if we accept that our resources are somewhat finite, then we need to ensure that everybody has access to at least basic levels of those resources so that they're able to participate in society, let alone democracy. Thirdly, non-violence. We're hippies, we don't like going to war. But I think if you dig a little bit deeper into it, it's about how do we create systems that don't neglect people who further down the track go, this thing doesn't work for me, let's overhaul the damn thing, and then we're back to the drawing board having another fight. Yep. Fourthly, appropriate decision-making. We like devolving decision-making powers down to the level where it actually affects people. And while our name is green and our colour is green, and of course we have always cared about the environment and continue to do so, we operate now in a far more complex world. I can tell you about my experience over the last 2 years of trying to get stories on climate change as this government has shredded the progress that we made over the last 6 years has been really bloody hard because of media bandwidth, but also because the top issue on everybody's mind is cost of living, which is where I kind of come to the conclusion that it's really hard to get people to care about the end of the world if they can't put food on the table for the end of the week. So we have a task of synthesising the reality that we currently exist within and helping people understand, as Jeanette herself actually once said, it's the same system that is exploiting the planet, which is also exhausting and exploiting people. And I guess just to take a step back even further and to reflect on some of the commentary that I've seen around, for example, people saying that our focus on human rights is somehow to the detriment of focus on climate or on the environment. I'm a climate activist not only because I care about our geckos and our bats and the state of our moana and our fish stocks, but because I care about all life on Earth. And I think that if you are to position yourself as a kind of conservationist that is only interested in walling things off over there and not about the whole world holistically and how everything interacts, then you might have a pretty narrow view of what it means to be a green. So the same threads are very clearly there. And, I was having these conversations with Jeanette right up until we lost her.
Do you think that the changing face, if I can put it in those terms, of the party, it's obviously been very successful with younger voters. I mean, you've picked up a lot of younger voters. Has it cost you older voters?
If we're to look at the demographics, we've still got some pretty staunch older voters. We've got a number of the campaigners who were heavily involved, over the last few decades in building up the party, who are still active party members as well. But yeah, look, I'd genuinely like to say that what I would love to see the Green Party as a force for is for all demographics, because again, to my point just before, all of our well-being is deeply interconnected. And I actually think that the way that a lot of modern politics is done through kind of segmenting voters and fixating on focus grouping and polling means that politicians are chasing their tail and not actually leading with solutions, because we're only looking at the things that are already on the table if we're doing that focus grouping and polling.
Do you think, though, that the party's become a little bit less likeable? There was something about that the first cohort in Parliament, that even if you didn't agree with the policy, a very likeable bunch of people, clearly well-intentioned. And as the party's changed, and James Shaw, I thought, deserves a lot of credit for the change and bringing a real feeling of credibility and deep thinking and wider thinking to the party, which it had to go through. But has some of the idealism got lost along the way?
Interesting question. I think some people would probably describe me as an idealist. And I would say, yes, I do have ideals. I do have a vision for a country in which everybody can thrive. But I also hope that I've proven myself a pragmatist in the sense that I'll do everything that I can and work with everybody that I can to actually make that a reality. In terms of the likeable point, I mean, you can tell me. All I can do is look in the mirror. We've also consistently grown our support to that effect. So I think in a lot of ways, what that has meant, yes, the party has been through growing pains and we have matured.
And it had to be, I think it was a change that had to be done, didn't it? If the party was going to capture a younger audience and move forward, and move away, generalising wildly here, but move away from the tree hugger image. That no, just
I still love hugging trees, just for the record.
But that was the label that followed the Greens around for years, was that? And you just
the Morris dancing,
and you don't hear that now. It's gone. So it was a change the party had to go through, and definitely one that's worked for the younger voters. I guess I'm just sort of wondering whether there was any sort of trade-off with that in terms of the appeal of the party to the older brigade and perhaps the real die-hard conservationists, because although you're very different in many ways, you're possibly more the Parliament now looks like a more natural environment for the party, a natural fit for the party than it did in the first place. I don't really know where I'm going with this, other than I think it's a change the party has gone through. There's obviously been some tremendous gains from it, but it was more just whether you felt there was any losses from the change.
Yeah, I do think that to a certain extent change is inevitable, and we live in markedly different times to what we did 30 or so years ago. I mean, as I just said before, I'm 31 years old, so I can't tell you what the state of the world looked like from my personal perspective, back in the early 90s. But I'd also make the points that the Greens were still standing pretty strong on some things that were considered pretty controversial back when we first came into Parliament. Sure. Like I'd remind you of, Nandor and his positions on drug law reform, which, were paired with his incredible work across the aisle on waste minimisation. We've always been a group of people in our respective caucuses that have brought life to all of those charter principles that I was referring to before, the things that we so deeply believe in, and an understanding of how all of those issues are so deeply intertwined and you have to consider them holistically, not in silos.
It must be frustrating when there are sideshows that happen, and I'm not going to name any names, we go into any details. There's been some big ones, let's be honest. I mean, that must be... I know on a personal level you connect with those individuals and want to support them, feel a lot of sympathy. On a party level, there must be an element of frustration that it undermines gains. Would that be fair to say?
I mean, the workplace of Parliament is unlike anywhere else. It's a fishbowl, right? And what that means is related to the point around metabolism that I was making before. In this new age, 24-hour news cycle, let alone the social media element that we're dealing with, there is this constant need for a new angle and a new fight and a new controversy, and not a heck of a lot of space to just be human beings and go, people make mistakes, let's deal with it and move on. And I think that is probably to the detriment of our politics and our democracy these days. I just want to be careful in caveating that is not to say that I don't believe that politicians should be held accountable. I absolutely believe that politicians should be held accountable.
For sure. But do you think that the Green Party and Te Pāti Māori get lined up a little bit more for an indiscretion than National or Labour?
I do. I mean, I think that the facts kind of speak to that in terms of the number of headlines that are generated in response to certain controversies. And I've reflected on why. And again, this is just my personal view, so any journalists who may seek to come at me, I'm more than happy to have a conversation. But I think that part of it, particularly in terms of our approach, because I can only really speak to the Greens approach and the approach that we've taken in the last 18 months as we've been forged in fire, is that we have a tendency to really try and explain everything that's going on and to front up consistently and not to hide, which potentially creates a rod for our own back because we produce all of these opportunities for people to ask us all these questions. I can't even remember what the issue was the other day, but I was on Ryan Bridges' show and he was kind of going me for, being accountable. And I was like, mate, I'm literally right here. I'm answering your questions. You can't say that I'm not being accountable when I responded late in the evening to your producer's request and I'm here first thing in the morning.
Can't get much more accountable than that.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about a little sideshow of your own, if I might? And it's a very minor, maybe it's not even a sideshow, but your OK Boomer comment in Parliament.
Lord, yeah.
I'm sorry to bring this up. And for the record, I am not a boomer. I just missed that description by a few years, and I'm going to stick to that. And it made headlines around the world, not so much here initially. But do you think that kind of comment, do you regret saying that? It's very dismissive. Is that sort of comment helpful?
So it's funny because this still comes up on the doors sometimes when we're out door knocking people in Auckland Central. Right. This happened about 8 years or so ago. And to provide people with some context, we were in the middle of, I believe, the second reading of the Zero Carbon Act. And I was making a speech about how, we were at that point in time experiencing tens of thousands of people taking to the streets, led by these incredible young people who actually didn't have the opportunity to vote. And by the year 2050 wouldn't even be 50 years old, which at that point in time was the average age in Parliament. So just kind of making this point about political power and who has the ability to engage in our democracy formally and who therefore has certain incentives for the lead times or the time horizons that we are contemplating when we're making this policy. And Todd Muller started heckling me about my age during it. And my little brother had been talking to me about that meme, and that just came to mind. So I just said that and then just kept saying my speech. And the amount of things that are said in Parliament that are not necessarily caught up on the mics or are not necessarily then repeated the next day in the news, if we did have a fixation on all of those things, would run out of newspaper headlines.
I reckon you could blame James Shaw. It was his reaction.
I'll take full responsibility for it. I did say the thing, but to your point of whether I regret it, look, I said at the time I am not interested in offending anybody. It wasn't intended to be a slur or to actually even be controversial in that way. It was just literally that Todd was having a crack at me about my age, and it was just the first thing that came to mind, and I responded. But I then actually declined doing a ton of interviews about it afterwards because I wasn't interested in that becoming the focus. I even turned down Dr. Phil, tried to get me on for that about some intergenerational warfare. And I was like, this is made up. There was a one-off comment in Parliament. I didn't want to offend anyone. But also, if we are to look at what the kind of meaning of comedy is supposed to be, not to pretend that I'm a comedian, but it is supposed to draw attention to power dynamics and who ends up making decisions and to kind of make, to draw that stuff into stark focus.
And I guess it goes back to what we were talking about at the start about loving and hating. A lot of people would have loved you for making that comment. I imagine, the younger brigade would have absolutely loved it. And of course the older ones.
There were a few self-declared boomers who emailed me as well about it. But again, I just want to make it really clear, it was an off-the-cuff comment that was not intended to cause any offence. But I also think that at the end of the day, if we are really to take ourselves that seriously and to get distracted by commentary like that, then maybe we're also kind of missing the point. So I'm sorry to anyone who was offended. I didn't mean to offend you.
And look, I'm sorry for bringing it up again. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because why do you think that got so much traction overseas? I mean, most people here maybe most people don't watch Question Time. It's probably part of it. But,
I mean, this kind of goes to what we were talking about with regard to what ends up making the news headlines. I have a lot of experience with how the things that I would say are really, really important, like the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the inequality crisis and the homelessness crisis, are very, very hard to get in the news, even when you have novel information and have done a heap of amount of research and have lined up all of these experts. It's complex and sometimes, according to editors, unwieldy to get across the line for whether it be a 6 p.m. news package or whatever. But something like a meme that ends up in Parliament and triggers a bit of controversy and therefore the clicks, well, I think that's easy fodder, isn't it? Yeah,
but you guys use that very well, though. I mean, you only have to look at your social media, yours personally and the parties, to know that you've capitalised on that very, very well. That's a very effective way of getting around that lack of coverage in the mainstream media, isn't it?
Yeah, being able to talk directly to people is awesome. I would say that my experience with social media, 10 years ago, 10 or so years ago, when I first ran for the Auckland mayoralty, which again was spurred by just kind of going, surely things can be better. Why don't we just organise ourselves accordingly? God forbid we have a debate about policies that Aucklanders care about. I don't know. If no one else is going to do it, I'll do it. I don't think that I would be where I am as a politician if social media wasn't as unfettered in its algorithmic bias. Nowadays, there's so much algorithmic bias that ends up producing people into those kind of polarities, or driving people into those polarities. But back in the day, it was far more free range, and I first got kind of a foot in the door and started building an audience, I think, in that digital space by just having stuff that was easily shared and got organic reach. And that then translated into being able to bring people into physical spaces where we could actually build genuine relationships, which is where I think real political power comes from, people understanding each other and having accountability to each other, and then organising ourselves to get the action that we want out of our politics.
But do you seriously give social media that much credit for where you are now? Has it played
I think it was a really important platform for me. Yeah, absolutely. Especially to be able to, because I was largely ignored by mainstream media to begin with, unless they were talking about my age. And that was such a joke that, my friends changed my name on our Facebook group chats to Chlöe Swarbrick, 22. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there's a number of variables that were obviously at play. I'd like to say that it was my evidence-based policy, but I think that social media and the ability to reach people where they were at was critical, and that is a heck of a lot harder for newcomers these days, which really does, I think, prompt the question about incumbency bias and about how power can self-entrench.
It's incredibly hard to manage as well, isn't it? Like you guys, I can't think of an exception, but you guys manage it so well. You've never had a false note. You've never said something on social media that I can recall off the top of my head where everybody's pounced on it for being utterly inappropriate or whatever. So, but there's plenty of other people in parties that have, right?
Yeah.
Even quite recently. So, it's something that you guys have managed extremely efficiently, isn't it?
And it's funny because I think a lot of that has been organic. I theoretically am of the digital native generation, so I grew up on the internet. But this is something I worry about with young people, nowadays, where they have been online for so long and, baby photos and stuff have been shared on social media, which again is no shade on anyone who's been doing that because we haven't been brought up with the requisite kind of media literacy. But the permissions that have been given to our tech overlords to take that content and to use it for whatever potentially nefarious means in terms of AI and the intellectual property stuff, this is where I think that we as a country are probably lagging quite substantially when it comes to the likes of a digital Bill of Rights. Yeah,
not to mention the cringe factor, which is ever present with some party leaders we could mention. But,
totally. And the impacts in other democracies where we've seen that, dumb stuff that people have said online 10 years ago comes back to haunt them. And I think that kind of speaks to some of the other issues that we were talking about where, I don't know, there's not space for people to apologise on their mistakes and for us to move on.
Cancel culture out of control?
I think that we really have to ask ourselves what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about cancel culture, right? Because my understanding of where that initially came from was about trying to flip those who hold kind of immense amounts of economic and cultural power, allowing those who don't hold all of that power, for whom, those at the peak may have potentially abused that power in relation to this other group. Well, it was an opportunity for those with less power to basically call them accountable. I think that has been morphed and manipulated into something which is about just deplatforming as a be-all and end-all and then thinking that the problems are resolved. There's so much that could be said about all of this stuff, but this is where I kind of come back down to the fact that, particularly as the left of politics, we really have to reconcile that if we are willing to believe that everybody can be the best possible version of themselves in the requisite environment and that rehabilitation over, punitive punishment, et cetera, then we have to reconcile that with the fact that we can't cancel somebody indefinitely for indiscretions on the internet. We have to provide them a pathway back to restorative justice or whatever. So I just, kind of come back to the fact that, you don't have to know someone to want them to live a good life. You don't even have to like them. Yeah. But the basis of my politics is that I think everybody should live a decent life. And you made reference there to being on the left of politics, quite obviously, and your natural alliances would obviously be more with Labour and Te Pāti Māori. But are you philosophically opposed to working with the right, or are you quite pragmatic about that you would if it achieved a goal that you believe in? I mean, you've obviously had some success with that in terms of drug reform and things like that. Yeah, totally. And I am currently working with some politicians on the right because they are the ones who hold the purse strings. So with some of the challenges that we're facing in Auckland Central, you might have seen some of the raru in the media where a bunch of my social service providers in Auckland City Centre got understandably spooked because they got wind of how the government was intending to legislate to criminalise homelessness, which, doesn't resolve the core issue, but in fact spins out into a bajillion other forms of issues. I then went and did the ring around of all of the ministers who I knew would be involved in it and got some calls back from those who I have constructive working relationships with over the last few years, and we'll get on the ground and we'll deal with it. And to that effect, hopefully I'm illustrating the point that I was making before, that while I have very strong ideals and very strong values, I also see the immense value in being pragmatic because, you can't cut off your nose to spite your face. We've got to move forward. We've got to just do stuff with the resources that are currently in front of us, with the options that are currently in front of us. And I'd prefer that we were moving forward. And I don't think that oftentimes that can end up being caricatured as compromising or capitulating on the things that you believe in. I think those are two quite different things, because I approach politics by being the same person in public as I am in private. So I'll be totally straight up and I'm not going to be shady, behind closed doors and then, go and spring some kind of press conference on people and, outmaneuver them or whatever. And I think that that's where you build those relationships that mean that you're capable and able to get things across the line. Cool. Now I'm going to give you an opportunity to hold up your green. Oh, my many different documents. Because obviously for the automotive sector, a lot of the automotive sector would be interested in your party's emissions policy if you came to power. Mm-hmm. Bearing in mind we've got time constraints, give us the water cooler summary of the Green Party emissions policy. Oh, man. Well, our emissions... Okay, the water cooler summary is that Hiara Anamata, our alternative emissions reduction plan, would reduce emissions 6 times faster than the government's so-called plan by stopping pollution at the source, as opposed to relying on gamifying offsets with the many issues that come with the likes of our emissions trading scheme. It would also require us to do domestic emissions reductions. One of the unspoken truths, I'd say actually one of the things that the Prime Minister and our current Minister of Finance are not being honest with the people of this country about, is that with every dollar that they are not investing in domestic emissions reduction, we are liable for potentially billions of dollars offshore to have other countries reduce their emissions under the Paris Agreement. And that could potentially crystallise in our constructive liabilities in the budget as early as next year. MFA and Treasury did some analysis and found a few years ago that the scale is anywhere from $3 billion to $24 billion. So we would do domestic emissions reductions, which would be paired with some of the things that I was talking about before, understanding that we can't only do climate action in a vacuum. We have to simultaneously improve people's lives. So it's about lowering the cost of living, improving people's quality of life, and rapidly reducing our climate changing emissions. As far as that impacts the automotive industry, that looks like increased public transport connections. It looks like more efficient vehicles. It looks as well like having a mind to air pollution. We're pretty far behind the rest of the world as far as that goes. And I think it'd be hard-pressed to find somebody opposed to those principles. But where it gets tricky, and I know that a lot of people in the industry would be interested in hearing your thoughts on this, is how you balance that against the fact that we have many, many businesses and many thousands of people who are effectively employed in the fossil fuel industry, whether it's a service station, whether it's a car dealer. And you
don't want businesses to close. You don't want people to lose their jobs. You don't want people to go through that hardship and stress. So how do you manage both?
So I think that this is where we need to understand that the writing is on the wall as far as climate change is concerned. It's like gravity. More scientists are of the opinion that climate change is a real thing and is going to exacerbate the frequency and intensity of severe weather events and sea level rise and heat waves and all of these things that are going to make life far harder. More scientists are in agreement on that than they are that tobacco kills people. So it is what it is. That is the facts. What that means is that we either have to change our economy in line with those facts, like gravity, or we have to watch our economy change around us in ways that are unplanned and therefore are going to cause a heck of a lot more devastation. So ironically, I think it was actually Winston Peters who, back when the original offshore oil and gas ban came into effect, when he spoke about the rapid economic reforms that happened in the 1980s because, quote-unquote, deregulation had to happen in his mind, he believed that happened at such a pace that, well, in the context of climate change, knowing what is coming, we can plan accordingly and do this thing called a just transition. Where I think that the idea of the just transition has lost some public support and understanding is that for many, and this is understandable given the power that massive multinational corporations have exerted in governments all across the world, is that it oftentimes can end up looking like just getting those peak bodies around the table and not the actual workers.
Right.
So this is where I would invite, everybody in the automotive industry to reach out. I'm more than happy to have a yarn. I'm more than happy to talk to people about what you think the future of the industry looks like or how those skills could be applied in a carbon neutral economy.
Well, I'm glad you raised that because I was going to ask you about whether there's a little bit of sort of mutual mistrust and almost like dislike of each other. I mean, there is certainly... And to a certain extent, it's inevitable, right? The green movement is on one side and the automotive industry is on the other side. And it is very hard to bridge the two. So it's probably actually very reassuring for a lot of people to hear you make that offer because it's a very difficult bridge to make, isn't it?
I'd say, I go back to that basic point that I think that we actually have a hell of a lot more in common than the sound bites and the headlines would typically lead one to believe. I had this experience when I first became co-leader where I desperately wanted to go and meet with some coal miners because we'd been pitched for time immemorial as mortal enemies. And I just didn't believe that. I think that if you, and this was definitely the case with these miners, went and sat down with them on the west coast of the South Island, and after, the original kind of concerns were aired around the views that the Greens hold around phasing out coal mining, we got to the roots of things, which is that all these guys wanted at the end of the day was a decent income, the ability to feel pride in what they do and to stay in their community. Those are the basic things that we can agree on. So if we're not fighting at the kind of peak or the tip of the iceberg of the argument, but instead we're figuring out how we can work together to achieve the actual needs that sit below that, then we're actually moving forward.
Quite a hard sell though, isn't it? If you're talking to a business that's invested a lot of money, maybe it's generational as well in their business that's been in the automotive sector and linked to fossil fuels for a long time, it must be a hard sell to say, we've got to think bigger picture. The earth is on borrowed time. If we don't, we have to find other ways to find employment for people and business opportunities in the industry for these people. And that is a hard sell, isn't it?
It's totally a hard sell, but I think the harder reality is that if we don't, then we'll be left up the creek without a paddle. So it's kind of a question of whether we want to do this transition in an orderly manner that brings everybody along or whether we want to watch things fall apart. Yeah. And I think as we can see right now with the record rates of inequality that we're experiencing, which by the way are the direct consequence or the direct cause of poverty being at the levels that it is too, all of those things are contributing to this erosion of our ability to participate in democracy, which is making things all the more fragile.
Why do you think, and maybe it hasn't, but why do you think the world seems to have gone backwards on climate change recently? I mean, we've obviously got some right-wing governments who are not heavily invested in addressing it, but why do you think that is? It feels like we've just lost a little bit of progress in the last year or two.
I think it's because the multi-billionaires don't want us talking about inequality, don't want us fixing the real foundational issues that we face in terms of where power sits and who owns all the resources and how decisions are made. They want us fighting culture wars, which are really convenient distractions. So all of the little people, all the regular hard-working people, at each other's jugulars while other people are laughing their way to the bank, which is why I'd invite people to really question, when the Greens, for example, proposed the idea of a wealth tax, which is not crazy in historical context when we've done, higher taxes on those who benefited handsomely during a time of hardship for many during the 1930s and 40s in order to create the welfare state, to create public housing, public healthcare, public education, and then, we went on to shred it in the 1980s. Listen to the people who are saying that we couldn't possibly do this, because those are the people who are currently screwing over most regular people. And I just tend to hold the view that we shouldn't only listen to the people who are benefiting from the status quo about why the status quo is apparently the only way that we can do things.
What do you say to people who say a wealth tax penalises success?
I'd say that, I would say that right now, some of the hardest working people who I interact with, whether that be in my electorate or across the country, are our nurses and our firefighters and our teachers who are spending well in excess of, 50, 60 hours a week doing their job and then everything else on top of that, and can barely afford to scrape together a living, let alone look after their family, let alone plan for the future. And if hard work equaled reward, we would not have the people who are responsible for the basic foundations of our society struggling to survive because they work really, really hard. Yeah. This is not to say that people who have accumulated immense amounts of wealth have not necessarily ever worked hard, but it is to say that at a certain point, which again the evidence belies, wealth just passively accumulates. And that is not something that you are actively working hard to create. But by virtue of the way that happens, we end up with a situation that wealth is being accumulated at the expense and at the cost of regular people. And if it is not being taxed and brought back into our collective capacity to fund things like our healthcare system and our education and our infrastructure, then ultimately I think that's to the detriment of the entire country. And we're seeing the consequences of that today.
All right. Oh, well, thank you very much indeed for coming in. There's a lot more that we could have talked about and might have to do again, actually, because my list is only half addressed, which is a bit of a shame. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and policies and recollections with us. It's really awesome. It's great to get to know you a little bit better. I really think it's great for the automotive sector in particular to get to know you a little bit better, because I do think there's a little bit of a rift there that would be great to address. So really appreciate you coming in and talking with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to building those bridges over said rifts.
Indeed, absolutely. Well, we'll take you on a tour. Well, MTA will facilitate a Green Party tour of the
Amazing. We'll take mass rapid transit.
How would that be? That's awesome. Look, if you've enjoyed chat as much as I have today, please remember to like and follow and do all those other things that we do on social media and on podcast channels. But in the meantime, thank you very much for listening and watching, if you've been watching us as well. And we will see you next time in the Fast Lane.